Welcome to a new chess game. This time we have Tal against his trainer Koblant. Let's get on with the game. White pawn moves to e4. Black pawn moves to c5. White knight moves to f3. Black knight moves to c6. White pawn moves to d4. Black pawn captures on d4. White knight captures on d4. Black knight moves to f6. White knight moves to c3. Black pawn moves to d6. White bishop moves to g5. Black pawn moves to e6. White queen moves to d2. Black bishop moves to e7. White king castles long. Black king castles short. White knight moves to b3. Black queen moves to b6. White pawn moves to f3. Black pawn moves to a6. White pawn moves to g4. Black rook moves to d8. White bishop moves to e3. Black queen moves to c7. White pawn moves to h4. Black pawn moves to b5. White pawn moves to g5. Black knight moves to d7. White pawn moves to g6. Black pawn captures on g6. White pawn moves to h5. Black pawn captures on h5. White rook moves to h5. Black knight moves to f6. White rook moves to h1. Black pawn moves to d5. White pawn moves to e5. Black knight captures on e5. White bishop moves to f4. Black bishop moves to d6. White queen moves to h2. Black king moves to f8. White queen moves to h8 plus. Black knight moves to g8. White rooks move to h7. Black pawn moves to f5. White bishop moves to h6. Black rook moves to d7. White bishop captures on b5. Black rook moves to f7. White rook moves to g1. Black rook moves to a7. White knight moves to d4. Black knight moves to g4. White pawn captures on g4. Black bishop moves to e5. White knight moves to c6. Black bishop captures on c3. White bishop moves to e3. Black pawn moves to d4. White rook moves to h1. Black rook moves to d7. White bishop moves to g5. Black pawn captures on a5. White rook moves to h6. Black pawn moves to d3. White pawn moves to bxc3. Black pawn moves to d2 plus. White king moves to d1. Black queen captures on c6. White rook moves to f6 plus. Black rook moves to f7. White queen captures on g7. Checkmate.